The high profile now enjoyed by the Holocaust or Shoah in public memory of the Second World War has contributed to the assumption that a major factor in waging the war against Germany and its European Axis allies was to end the genocide and liberate the remaining Jewish populations. This is largely an illusion. The war was not fought to save Europe's Jews, and indeed the governments of all three major Allied powers worried lest the public should think this to be the case. Liberation, when it came, was a byproduct of a broader ambition to expel the Axis states from their conquests towards the Jews. The attitude of the Allied powers was by turns negligent, cautious, ambivalent, or morally questionable. The way that the Allied powers viewed the so called Jewish question was shaped, on the one hand, by pre war responses to the challenges posed by German anti Semitism, and on the other, by the rise of Zionism and assertions of Jewish nationhood. Soviet policy towards the Jews was dictated in particular by hostility to Zionist aspirations that challenged Jewish allegiance to the Soviet system. Stalin had a long held view that Soviet Jews were unassimilable in the new Soviet Union, and he resented what he saw as their desire for segregation. Zionists were persecuted and driven underground. Jewish emigration was reduced to a trickle by the early 1930s and from 1934 banned altogether. Jewish workers were not allowed time off to celebrate the Sabbath, and hundreds of synagogues were closed down. When 2 million additional Jews came under Soviet rule in 1939 and 1940, with the occupation of eastern Poland and the Baltic states, they were subjected to the destruction of their traditional way of life. Across the region, an estimated 250,000 Jews were deported to the Soviet interior. Thousands of rabbis and Jewish leaders were arrested and sent to the Soviet concentration camps. Synagogues were closed or converted to other uses, businesses taken into state ownership, and Jewish public religious and cultural rituals suppressed. The traditional life of the small town shtetl communities was emasculated long before the arrival of the Germans in 1941. In Britain and the United States, the Jewish question was bound up with anxieties about the effect of large scale Jewish immigration prompted by increased persecution, and in the British case, concern that Jewish migration should not upset the fragile security of their League mandates in the Middle East. Although in neither case explicitly or overtly anti Semitic, fear of the social or political consequences of opening the doors to Jewish refugees without restriction governed the response of both governments. During the 1930s, substantial numbers of Jewish immigrants nevertheless succeeded in escaping from Germany and the areas annexed in 1938-39, a total of approximately 360,000 between 1933 and 1939. Of this number, 57,000 found sanctuary in the United States, 53,000 in Britain's Palestine Mandate, and 50,000 in the British Isles. There was also substantial immigration of European Jews from other countries where antisemitism had become by the 1930s a more acute problem. The total number of Jewish immigrants to Palestine was 215,232 between 1933 and 1939, doubling the Jewish population of the region. It was this influx that most affected the British government's approach to the problem of Jewish refugees. In 1936, a widespread Arab revolt was prompted by the arrival in Palestine of the fresh wave of Jews from Europe. The revolt tied down much of the small British army in the territory in 1936-39 and threatened Britain's strategic position in the Middle East. The result was a final decision in 1939, published in a white paper in May, to limit further Jewish migration to 75,000 over 5 years and then to suspend it entirely unless the Arab community acquiesced, which was an unlikely outcome. An initial 6 month ban was imposed on all immigration as a penalty for large scale illegal entry. In 1939, only 16,000 were allowed legally into Palestine, but there were 11,000 who managed to enter illicitly. To rub salt in the wound, the government paper also ruled out the prospect of a separate state for Jews, which was the principal Zionist ambition. The guidelines laid down in spring 1939 governed British policy throughout the war, disastrously closing off what had been one of the most important escape routes for Jewish refugees. Immigration to Britain itself was curtailed at just the point when German anti-Semitism reached a new level of intense discrimination and persecution following the Kristallnacht pogrom in November 1938. A number of unaccompanied children were allowed on the so-called Kindertransporte, and by July 1939, 7,700 had reached Britain. But adult refugees faced increased problems in meeting British criteria for entry and acquiring the necessary visas. The British authorities preferred Jewish immigrants who could be supported by Jewish organizations and had some useful skill or filled a gap in the labor market. But the Home Office preference was for Jews who promised to re-immigrate after arrival in Britain. This was a prospect progressively reduced as the war approached. Quotas and restrictions on immigrants were shared across the Western world. In the United States, these restrictions did not apply to Jews directly because they were treated as citizens of their particular country, but this meant long waiting lists for visas for up to 2 years and no exceptions once a country's quota was full. On this, the United States government refused to make concessions to the particular crisis facing European Jews. When Roosevelt was pressured to allow easier entry for Jews after Kristallnacht, he merely commented, "The time is not ripe for that." Opinion polls, to which Roosevelt was always alert, showed that 75% of Americans considered that the Jews possessed undesirable traits, while 72% were opposed to any additional Jewish immigration. A bill introduced into Congress in January 1939, the so-called Children's Bill, to allow 20,000 refugee children into the United States over a 2-year period, prompted no public response or support from the president and failed at the committee stage. Opinion polls again showed strong opposition from the public.